A carriage wheel struck a hidden stone on the road to Ashcombe, and the whole world seemed to tip sideways with it. Rain fell in long grey ropes that evening, turning the lane into a river of mud. Inside the carriage sat a young woman named Abigail Stephenson, clutching a letter that promised to save her family from ruin. She did not yet know that within the hour she would have to choose between that promise and a stranger's life. The axle cracked first. Then the horses screamed, rearing against their harnesses as the carriage tilted and slid toward the stone wall bordering the estate. Abigail was thrown against the door, and for one long breath, she thought the journey that was meant to rescue her family would instead end it. Watching from the stable yard, a man in a mud-spattered coat froze at the sound. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. His hands were rough, from 3 months of honest labor, though they had not always been so. The servants called him Johnson. He answered to it now more easily than he answered to his true name. He was, in truth, Andrew Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe. He had traded his fine coats for stable leathers on a cold morning in early spring, after watching yet another woman smile sweetly at him and then turn away, visibly uncomfortable, from his younger sister Rosie's wheeled chair. He had decided, quietly and completely, that he would rather live as a servant than marry a woman who could not look past what Rosie could no longer do, to see who Rosie still was. Now, in the pouring rain, Andrew ran toward the wreck of the carriage, before he had time to think about who he was pretending to be. He was not the only one running. A second figure, smaller, moving with quick, sure steps despite a leg that did not bend easily, had already reached the wreckage. It was Rosie herself, out for her evening ride along the garden path in her chair, close enough to see the crash happen before her brother did, and Abigail, bruised and soaked, climbing free of the broken carriage door with her own hands, did not look toward the grand house for help. She looked toward Rosie. She ran toward Rosie, because somewhere on the muddy ground, in the confusion of rain and screaming horses, Rosie's chair had tipped, and no one, not the coachman, not the stable boys, not a single soul with a title to protect, had gone to her first. Abigail did. That single choice, made in the space of 3 heartbeats, was about to change 4 lives forever. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this evening finds you well and in good spirits. As we walk together toward a milestone of 1,000 cherished subscribers, I ask for a small piece of your kindness. If tales of hidden titles, quiet courage, and love, earned rather than given, please your heart, then subscribe, leave your like upon this video, and take your place among our growing company of storytellers. Before we step further into this tale, tell us in the comments below, from which corner of the world do you watch tonight, and what hour does the clock strike where you are? I read every single one, and I would love nothing more than to say hello to you personally, just to see how far across the world this story has traveled. Every subscription, every like, and every kind word helps this small candle of a channel burn a little longer. For that, you have my sincere thanks. Now, without further delay, let us return to Ashcombe. 3 months earlier, Andrew Whitmore had stood in his own ballroom and watched a parade of eligible young women file past his sister's chair as though it were an obstacle to be stepped around rather than a person to be greeted. Rosie had noticed. Rosie always noticed. She simply no longer said anything about it out loud. That night, after the guests had gone, Andrew found his sister alone in the conservatory, staring out at the dark garden. "You do not have to keep bringing them here," Rosie said, without turning around. "I am not a test they need to pass to marry a duke." "You are exactly that," Andrew answered. "Any woman unwilling to see you is unworthy of seeing me." Rosie laughed, though it was not a happy sound. "Then you may die a bachelor, brother, because not one of them has looked at me twice tonight." It was that sentence, more than any other, that sent Andrew to his estate manager 2 days later with an unusual request: a plain set of stable clothes, and strict instructions that no one, not the housekeeper, not the butler, not even his own valet, was to address him by his title anywhere near the stable yard. He gave himself the name Johnson. It belonged to no one in his family, which was precisely the point. He mucked stalls, he carried feed, his hands blistered, then hardened. He learned, for the first time in 34 years, what it felt like to be looked through by people who assumed he had nothing worth their attention. It taught him something he had not expected. Every stable boy, every kitchen maid, every visiting merchant who spoke to him without knowing his rank, showed him a kindness or a cruelty that had nothing to do with his fortune. He began to understand which of the two was rarer than he had believed. There had been other candidates before Abigail, other young women who came through Ashcombe's doors during those 3 months, drawn by invitations Andrew had quietly arranged through friends and family connections, each one unaware that the estate's newest stable hand was the very man they hoped to impress. Most had been perfectly pleasant to Rosie when Andrew or a servant was watching, and had grown noticeably cooler the moment they believed themselves unobserved. One young lady, from a respectable family in Sussex, had gone so far as to ask a housemaid, in a voice she assumed carried no further, whether the crippled sister would be present at supper, so that she might plan her seating accordingly. Andrew had said nothing at the time, only excused himself to the stables, where he had stood alone in the dark for a long while, feeling the last of his patience for society drain quietly away. He had nearly given up the entire experiment by the time autumn arrived, ready to accept that perhaps genuine kindness, offered freely and without hope of reward, simply did not exist among people who had any notion of what a dukedom was worth. It was, he would later admit to Rosie, the very last week of his patience when the carriage broke its axle at his gate. Abigail Stephenson had not wanted to become a governess. She had wanted, more than anything, to keep her father's small estate in Kent standing upright against the debts he had left behind when he died. The letter offering her a position at Ashcombe House had arrived like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. The wages were generous. The household was respectable. And most importantly, accepting the post meant she would not yet have to sell the last piece of land that held her family's name. She had not expected the carriage to break apart 3 miles from the gate. She had certainly not expected to spend her first evening at Ashcombe kneeling in the mud beside a stranger's overturned wheeled chair, working frantically to free the young woman trapped beneath its wheel. "Hold still," Abigail said, working the wheel free, with hands that shook from cold and fear both. "I have you. You are not alone." Rosie stared up at her, startled less by the accident than by the fact that a complete stranger had come to her before checking whether the carriage's other passenger, clearly a lady of some means, required assistance first. "Most people go to the fine dress before the broken girl," Rosie said quietly, once she was upright and steady. "Then most people are looking at the wrong thing," Abigail answered. It was Johnson who reached them next, breathless, mud to his knees, lifting Rosie back into her chair with practiced gentleness. He caught Abigail's eye for only a moment. "You came to her first," he said. It was not quite a question. "Was I meant to come to her second?" Abigail asked, genuinely confused. Andrew, Johnson, in that moment, said nothing more, but something in his chest, long closed like a shuttered window, opened by a single narrow crack. Abigail was meant to teach French and pianoforte to the daughters of a neighboring household, a temporary arrangement, while Ashcombe's own governess recovered from illness. It gave her reason to remain at the estate for several weeks, and it gave Rosie, who had no lessons to attend and no patience left for pity, a companion who treated her exactly as she wished to be treated, as a person, first and always. They took to walking the garden paths together each afternoon, Rosie wheeling herself with fierce independence, while Abigail matched her pace, without ever offering to push unless asked. "You do not flinch when my chair catches on the gravel," Rosie observed one afternoon. "Should I? Everyone else does, as though my difficulty is theirs, to feel embarrassed about." Abigail considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "I think people mistake pity for kindness, because pity is easier. Kindness requires you to actually see the person in front of you." Rosie laughed. A real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind Andrew had not heard from his sister in over a year. He was crossing the yard with a bale of hay when he heard it, and he stopped walking entirely, standing very still in the sunlight, listening. That evening, Rosie cornered her brother in the stable, where he thought no one would think to look for a duke. "I know it is you," she said simply. Andrew's hands stilled on the bridle he was mending. "Rosie, I have known for a fortnight. You forgot to disguise the scar on your knuckle from the hunting accident when you were 16. She folded her arms. "I will not tell her, but I will say this. She came to me first, Andrew, before she knew your name, before she knew there was a fortune to be gained from kindness to a duke's sister. She simply came." Andrew looked at his sister for a long moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there." A quiet afternoon, humor among the stable hands. Not every day at Ashcombe carried the weight of secrets and stolen glances. Some afternoons were simply warm, and slow, and full of small foolishness. One such afternoon, the head groom, a broad, cheerful man named Old Pratt, decided that Johnson's education as a stable hand remained incomplete without a lesson in shoeing a horse properly. Andrew, who had never in his life held a farrier's hammer, made a spectacular mess of the attempt, nearly dropping a horseshoe on his own boot, and earning himself a bruised thumb and the undying amusement of every stable boy present. "A duke would know better than to hammer his own hand," Rosie called from the fence, wheeling herself close enough to watch, laughter bright in her voice. "A duke," Andrew muttered, shaking his stinging thumb, "has never once been required to shoe a horse in his entire privileged life, and now understands precisely why." Abigail, arriving with a basket of apples meant for the horses, caught the tail end of the exchange and could not help laughing along with the stable boys, though she had no idea what private joke passed between brother and sister. "You are dreadful at this," she told Johnson cheerfully, watching him fumble with the horseshoe a second time. "I am aware," Andrew said dryly. "I am told a real stable hand manages it without drawing blood from himself." "Perhaps," Abigail offered, taking the hammer gently from his hand and demonstrating the proper angle with surprising confidence. "You simply need a better teacher than Old Pratt." Old Pratt, delighted rather than offended, declared loudly that he had been replaced by a governess half his age and size, to the great amusement of everyone within earshot. It was, Andrew thought later, one of the finest afternoons he could remember in years. Not because anything of consequence had happened, but because for one golden hour, no one in that yard was pretending to be anything other than exactly who they were. First offer. The fortune with a cruel price. The letter arrived at the end of Abigail's third week at Ashcombe, delivered by a solicitor's clerk, who insisted on placing it directly into her hands. It came from a Mr. Silas Crane, a wealthy investor Abigail had never met, offering to purchase her late father's estate in Kent for a sum 3 times its worth, enough to clear every debt, restore the house, and leave a comfortable income besides. There was only one condition attached to the offer, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Miss Stephenson must resign her position at Ashcombe House immediately and sever all contact with the Whitmore family, including Miss Rosie Whitmore, whose ongoing care Mr. Crane's household was, the letter claimed, better equipped to provide. Abigail read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for some misunderstanding. There was none. A stranger was offering to save her family's entire future, on the sole condition that she abandon a young woman who had finally begun to laugh again because of her. She did not need 3 days to decide, though she gave herself one sleepless night regardless, staring at the ceiling of her small room, thinking of her father's empty house and thinking of Rosie's laughter echoing across the garden. By morning, she had made her choice. She wrote back a single line: "I am not for sale, and neither is my friendship. Do not write to me again." She told no one at Ashcombe about the offer. Not yet. She did not want kindness to look like sacrifice, when to her, it had simply felt like the only decent thing to do. What Abigail could not explain, in the weeks that followed, was Johnson. He spoke, when he forgot himself, like a man who had been educated at Oxford, rather than raised in a stable loft. He gave quiet instructions to the head groom that were somehow always obeyed without question. Once, she saw him correct a visiting wine merchant's arithmetic without glancing at a single ledger. "You are a strange sort of stable hand," she told him one evening, finding him mending a fence at the edge of the orchard. "Strange how?" he asked, not looking up. "You speak like a gentleman who has fallen on hard times and is too proud to admit it." Andrew allowed himself a small, careful smile. "Perhaps I simply listen to gentlemen more carefully than most stable hands trouble themselves to." "Perhaps," Abigail said, unconvinced, but too polite to press further. She found herself, against her better judgment, watching for him each day, not out of any romantic intention, she told herself firmly, but out of simple curiosity about a puzzle she could not quite solve. He, in turn, found every excuse to be near the garden paths at the hour Rosie and Abigail took their afternoon walk, and told himself the very same lie. The conspiracy against Rosie had begun long before Abigail ever arrived at Ashcombe, though its shape only became clear once its architects grew impatient. Andrew's cousin, Reginald Ashworth, stood 2 places removed from the dukedom, and had spent years quietly resentful of an inheritance he would never hold so long as Andrew lived, and remained unmarried and without complication. Rosie's accident, and the tender protectiveness it had drawn from her brother, had given Reginald an idea he found both practical and, in his own mind, entirely reasonable. If Rosie could be persuaded, or paid, to withdraw quietly from society and from Ashcombe altogether, claiming a preference for a private life away from public scrutiny, then Andrew's protective instincts would ease. A carefully arranged marriage to a political ally's daughter could then be steered forward, strengthening Reginald's own standing through family connection, while Rosie was comfortably, permanently, elsewhere. Mr. Silas Crane, the investor, was Reginald's chosen instrument. His fortune offer to Abigail had been the first attempt to remove an inconvenient ally from Rosie's side. When that failed, Reginald grew bolder, arranging through a forged letter to have Rosie's physician recommend a private convalescent home in the north, under the guise of superior treatment, but in truth, simply a comfortable exile. Andrew, still hidden behind his stable disguise, overheard the plan entirely by accident, delivering feed to the estate office late one evening and catching Reginald's voice through a half-closed door, speaking to Crane about arrangements that made his blood run cold. He said nothing that night. He needed proof, not suspicion, before he could bring down a member of his own family in front of all England. A night of suspicion. 2 nights later, Andrew returned to the estate office, long after the household had gone to bed, determined to search the ledgers for any trace of the payments Reginald had discussed. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single guttering candle, and every board beneath his boots seemed suddenly louder than it had any right to be. He had barely reached the desk when he heard footsteps in the hall outside, unhurried and deliberate. He blew out the candle and pressed himself into the shadow behind the tall bookcase, heart pounding in a way it had not since his soldiering days as a younger man. The door opened. A lantern swung into the room, and for one terrible moment, Andrew believed he had been caught. Then the light steadied, and he recognized the figure holding it. "You may come out from behind the bookcase," Abigail said quietly, not turning around. "I heard you moving from the garden path. You are not nearly as silent as you believe yourself to be, Johnson." Andrew stepped out, feeling, for the first time in 3 months, thoroughly foolish. I did not wish to alarm anyone. You have alarmed me considerably less than the sound of Reginald's voice through that same door 2 nights past, Abigail said, setting the lantern down. I heard him too, from the hallway. I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough to be frightened for Rosie. They searched the ledgers together that night, speaking in low voices, careful of every creaking floorboard, and though they found nothing conclusive before dawn, forced them both back to their rooms. Something had shifted between them, in the shared danger of it. They had stopped being a stable hand and a governess keeping polite distance, and had become, without quite naming it, allies. A moment in the garden. It happened on an ordinary evening, in the hour between supper and dark, when Rosie had retired early with a headache, and the garden stood empty except for the 2 of them. "May I ask you something honest?" Abigail said, standing close beside the old stone fountain where they had walked so many afternoons before. "You may. Why does a stable hand know the exact date of the Battle of Trafalgar, correct 3 languages of poetry without effort, and stand as though he has spent his whole life being watched by people expecting him to stand a certain way?" Andrew did not answer immediately. The evening light had turned soft and gold, catching the loose strands of hair at her temple, and he found himself considerably more interested in that than in maintaining a disguise he already suspected she had seen through weeks ago. "Perhaps," he said quietly, stepping closer than strict propriety allowed. "I have simply had an unusual education for a man who mucks stalls." "Perhaps," Abigail agreed softly, not stepping back. For one long suspended moment, neither of them moved, the space between them narrowing to something neither was yet brave enough to close. Then a bell rang faintly from the house, calling the household to evening prayers, and the moment passed as gently as it had arrived, leaving behind only the certainty, for both of them, that whatever this was, it had stopped being pretend some time ago. Second offer. Choosing right again. Crane wrote to Abigail once more, doubling his offer, growing careless in his desperation. This time, he added a threat thinly disguised as concern. Continued association with the Whitmore family, he wrote, might expose Miss Stephenson to scandal she could not survive. Abigail brought the second letter directly to Rosie. "Someone wants me gone," she said simply, laying the letter on the table between them. "And they are willing to pay a great deal to make it happen." Rosie read it twice, her face going pale, then hard. "This is Reginald's doing. I would wager my chair on it. Your cousin? My cousin, who has wanted my brother's title since we were children, and who has never once, in 20 years, asked after my health, unless it served some purpose of his own." Abigail folded the letter carefully and set it down. "Then he will have to try considerably harder, because I am not leaving." Rosie reached across and took her hand. "You could have a fortune, Abigail. You could save everything your father built." "I could," Abigail agreed, "but I would have to leave you to buy it, and I find I no longer wish to make that trade." Ashcombe's annual charity ball, held each autumn to benefit the county's poor, had never before carried quite so much weight. Andrew, as himself, in his own name and his own fine coat, was expected to attend as host. Rosie insisted on attending as well, despite Reginald's not-so-subtle suggestion that the excitement might overtax her health. Abigail attended as Rosie's companion, wearing a borrowed gown of deep burgundy that Rosie herself had insisted upon, and finding herself, for the first time in weeks, in the same room as the true Duke of Ashcombe, dressed as the man he actually was. She did not recognize him, not at first. Not until he crossed the ballroom floor directly toward her, moving with the same quiet, careful gait she had watched cross a muddy stable yard 100 times. "You," she said, the word barely a whisper. "Miss Stephenson." Andrew bowed properly, formally, as though they had never spoken a single word to each other in a stable yard. "I believe we have not yet been introduced. I am Andrew Whitmore." "Johnson," she said, still not quite believing it. "There was never a Johnson." he admitted quietly. Only ever me, in worse clothes. Before Abigail could respond, Reginald appeared at her elbow, smiling the practiced smile of a man rehearsing a performance. Miss Stephenson, what a pleasure. I understand you have grown remarkably close to my cousin's household in a short time. I have, Abigail said carefully. How fortunate, Reginald said, that such closeness has not proven costly to you. The words carried a warning beneath their pleasantness that Abigail did not fully understand until later that same evening. Reginald made his final move before the night's end, cornering Abigail near the terrace doors, while Andrew was occupied greeting other guests. I will be direct, Miss Stephenson, since subtlety has clearly failed, he said. Mr. Crane's offer still stands, improved considerably. Take it tonight. Leave Ashcombe before morning, and your father's estate will be restored by week's end. Refuse, and I promise you this, Rosie Whitmore will be removed from this house, regardless of anything you do, and you will have gained nothing but the satisfaction of watching it happen. Removed to where? Abigail asked, cold fear settling in her stomach. Somewhere she will be comfortable, Reginald said smoothly, and somewhere considerably more convenient for the rest of us. Abigail understood, in that moment, precisely what she was being asked to become complicit in. She found Rosie within minutes, and together they found Andrew, and the three of them stood in a quiet corner of the terrace, while Abigail repeated Reginald's words exactly as she had heard them. Andrew's expression, usually so carefully controlled, went utterly still with fury. He means to have you sent away, while I am occupied with a marriage he intends to arrange. Then let him try it in front of everyone, Rosie said, chin lifted. I am done being discussed, as though I cannot hear the conversation. It was Abigail, in the end, who found the proof they needed. Returning briefly to the house to fetch Rosie's shawl, she passed the estate office and noticed the door standing slightly open, a single lamp still burning within. On the desk lay a letter, half finished, in Reginald's own hand, addressed to the physician who had recommended Rosie's northern convalescent home, instructing him plainly on the sum to be paid for his cooperation, and the wording he should use to make the arrangement appear medically necessary. Abigail did not hesitate. She took the letter, folded it carefully into her sleeve, and returned to the ballroom with her heart pounding harder than it had during the carriage accident 3 months before. She did not manage to return unnoticed, however. A footman loyal to Reginald had spotted her slipping from the estate office and alerted his master at once. Abigail heard fast, uneven footsteps behind her before she reached the main hall, and understood with a cold jolt that Reginald himself was following her, moving with far more urgency than any gentleman at a ball ought to show. Miss Stephenson, his voice, when it reached her, had lost every trace of its earlier smoothness. I believe you have taken something that does not belong to you. Abigail did not stop walking. I believe you have done something that does not belong in a respectable house, and I intend to see it corrected. He caught her arm at the base of the grand staircase, his grip far tighter than propriety allowed. Give me the letter, and we need never speak of this again. Let go of my arm, Abigail said, her voice low and steady, despite the fear pounding through her chest. Or every guest in that ballroom will hear exactly why you are so desperate to stop a governess in a hallway. For one dangerous moment, Reginald's grip only tightened. Then a voice cut through the corridor, quiet, but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. Take your hand off her, Reginald. Andrew stood at the top of the staircase, no longer troubling to disguise the fury in his voice. Reginald released Abigail's arm at once, stepping back as though burned. Andrew, this is not what it— Save your explanation for the magistrate, Andrew said, descending the stairs. I have heard quite enough of your explanations already. She placed the letter directly into his hand. He read it once, his jaw tightening with each line, and then he did something Abigail had not expected. He walked directly to the small orchestra stand at the head of the ballroom and asked, quietly but firmly, for the music to stop. The ballroom fell silent by degrees, conversation dying away as the guests turned to see their host standing alone at the center of the floor, a folded letter held visibly in one hand. "I owe this gathering an explanation," Andrew said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet, "and an apology for the deception I am about to reveal." He explained it plainly. The stable hand named Johnson, the 3 months spent testing the honesty of a household and the character of the people who moved through it, unaware they were being watched. He did not spare himself in the telling, admitting freely that he had begun the disguise out of bitterness, and had ended it having learned considerably more than he had set out to learn. Then he read Reginald's letter aloud, word for word, before the entire assembled county. A murmur swept the room as Andrew read, growing louder with every line, until several guests turned openly to stare at Reginald, who stood frozen near the terrace doors with the look of a man watching his own reputation collapse in real time. "This is a fabrication," Reginald managed at last, though his voice shook. "Andrew, you cannot possibly believe." "I recognize your hand, Reginald," Andrew said quietly. "I have known it since we were boys, learning our letters together. Do not insult this room further by denying it." Lady Farrow, an elderly guest, known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper memory, spoke into the silence that followed. "Well," she said, tapping her fan against her palm, "I always did think it strange that a man so eager to discuss his cousin's marriage prospects had so little to say about his own." A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension, and Reginald, sensing the room had turned entirely against him, made for the door with what remained of his composure. He did not get far. 2 footmen, acting on instructions Andrew had quietly given earlier that same week, in case matters came to exactly this point, blocked the entrance until the local magistrate, himself a guest that evening, could be properly informed. Reginald's protests died quickly under the weight of his own handwriting. Mr. Crane, present that evening as Reginald's guest, made a hurried and undignified exit before the magistrate could reach him, though he would be found and formally charged with fraud within the fortnight. Andrew turned, at last, to Abigail, who stood beside Rosie's chair, exactly where she had stood the very first day they met. "You were offered a fortune twice," he said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "and twice you chose my sister instead. I have spent 3 months testing whether kindness without reward still exists in this world. I did not expect, when I found it, that I would also find the only woman I have ever wished to marry." A ripple of astonished whispers moved through the ballroom. Abigail felt her face grow warm, though she did not look away from him. "I did not come to Ashcombe for a title," she said. "I came to save my father's house. I stayed for Rosie. I never once did it for a duke." "I know," Andrew said, crossing the floor toward her. "That is precisely why it must be you." The proposal. He did not propose that same night, in front of the whole county, though he wished to. Instead, 3 days later, once the scandal had settled, and Reginald's disgrace had been formally recorded, Andrew found Abigail in the garden, where they had first walked beside Rosie's chair, and knelt in the grass in his own name, wearing his own fine coat, hiding nothing at all. "I have very little practice at this," he admitted. "I have spent 3 months learning to be an honest stable hand, and rather less time learning to be an honest duke." "You are managing both remarkably well tonight," Abigail said, laughing, despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Marry me," Andrew said simply. "Not because you passed a test, not because of what you refused to take from Crane. Marry me, because you are the first person I have met in years who saw my sister before she ever saw my fortune, and because I would very much like to spend the rest of my life learning to be worthy of that same clear sight." Abigail knelt down in the grass beside him, ruining a perfectly good gown without a single thought for the cost of it. "Yes," she said, "for exactly those reasons, and none of the others. My noble friends, before this tale gathers its final threads, may I ask one small kindness of you? If this story has warmed your heart even a little, if it has reminded you that goodness still has value in a world that so often rewards the opposite, then I would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe, leave your like below, and pass this story along to someone who still believes in it too. And I ask you this, honestly as one storyteller to another, if the choice had been yours, standing in Abigail's place, the fortune in one hand and Rosie's friendship in the other, which would you have chosen? Tell me below. I read every answer, and I promise you, they teach me as much as any story I could ever write. Now, let us finish what we began. The wedding took place the following spring, in the same garden where a broken carriage had once brought two strangers together in the rain. Reginald Ashworth was stripped of his place in the family and his standing in the county, his fraud and forgery laid bare in a magistrate's court that drew spectators from 3 neighboring shires. Mr. Silas Crane fared little better, his fortune seized to repay the very families he had attempted to swindle, including, at Andrew's insistence, a full and generous restoration of Abigail's father's estate in Kent, offered freely this time, with no condition attached beyond her acceptance of it. Rosie stood beside her brother at the wedding, dressed in soft lavender, her chair decorated with ribbons she had chosen herself, with unhidden delight. In the years that followed, she became known throughout the county not as the Duke's unfortunate sister, but as a determined advocate for the fair treatment of people living with disability, founding a small charitable trust that funded proper wheeled chairs and walking aids for families who could not otherwise afford them. Abigail became Duchess of Ashcombe, not because she had pursued the title, but because she had refused, twice, to place a fortune above a friend. She never forgot what it had cost her to say no, nor what it had given her in return. She wrote to her father's old tenants in Kent within the month, assuring them that nothing about the estate's management would change beyond its finally being free of debt, and she visited the house herself each summer thereafter, walking the same halls she had once feared losing forever, grateful in a way that never quite faded with time. Old Pratt remained head groom at Ashcombe for another decade, and delighted for the rest of his life in telling any visitor willing to listen that he had once taught a duke to shoe a horse, badly, and had the bruised thumb of a duchess to prove she had taught him better. And Andrew, who had begun his strange experiment, believing that genuine kindness no longer existed among the fashionable and the wealthy, learned instead that it had simply been waiting, all along, for someone willing to test it honestly, and for someone brave enough to pass that test without ever realizing she was being watched. As the last of the wedding guests departed Ashcombe House that evening, lanterns glowing gently along the garden paths, every soul in this tale received precisely what their choices had earned. Reginald and Mr. Crane faced the full and public consequence of their deceit. Rosie found not merely acceptance but genuine purpose, her voice carrying farther than her chair ever could. Andrew set aside both his disguise and his doubt, having found in Abigail a partner who required no test to prove her worth, only the chance to be herself. And Abigail, who had asked for nothing more than her father's house and a fair wage, found instead a family who loved her exactly as fiercely as she had loved them first. Thank you, noble viewers, for walking this road to Ashcombe with me tonight. Until our paths cross again, may your own kindness go unwitnessed and unrewarded by no one who truly matters. May your courage steady your hand when the choice grows difficult, and may every good thing you offer the world return to you in its own good time. Farewell, dear friends, and may your next story begin very soon. Moral and educational reflections. 1. Kindness shown without an audience is the truest measure of character. Andrew's disguise revealed that people often behave very differently when they believe no one of consequence is watching. True decency does not require applause. 2. People living with disability deserve to be seen as whole people, not as burdens or obstacles. Rosie's journey from being overlooked to becoming a respected advocate reflects a simple but often forgotten truth. Dignity is not something to be granted. It is something that was never lost in the first place. 03. Integrity sometimes costs more than it appears to reward, at least at first. Abigail's refusal of Crane's fortune was not a calculated gamble that paid off. It was a decision made without any guarantee of reward, which is precisely what made it meaningful. 4. Wealth and status cannot manufacture trust or genuine connection. Reginald's downfall came from believing that money could purchase loyalty and silence. It could not, and it never truly does. 5. Honest actions, repeated quietly and consistently, speak far louder than a single grand gesture. Andrew did not fall in love with a speech or a performance. He fell in love with a pattern of small, unrewarded choices, made the same way, whether anyone was watching or not.